we need to examine our lives very carefully. So I always like to think, and it was actually my god sister Lakshmi Moni who wrote a very beautiful poem about this, but I don't have the poem on hand that I can show you, but she was basically saying, imagine if Prabhupada comes knocking on your door, Srila Prabhupada comes knocking on your door. What will he find? Will he find a home that's Krishna conscious? Will he find a home where devotees are living, the husband, the wife, the children are living harmoniously? So that's very important, that we always think, you know, it's one thing to be at the temple and we may present a certain persona when we're at the temple, but when we go home, we need to make sure that we bring that Vaishnava mentality and attitude into the home as well, even behind, you know, the locked doors, so to speak. So a home that is peaceful and non-violent, a home that Krishna in our heart would be pleased with, because don't forget, Krishna is witnessing all of our activities, and inhabited by devotees who are gentle, peaceful, and trying to serve Srila Prabhupada in a sincere way, both at the temple where everyone can see us and in the privacy of our home. And that's where the Lord is surely witnessing that as well. Slide 4, please. So some of you who are watching this, you may have experienced some form of domestic and family violence, or you may know someone who has. So if in the course of this seminar, something triggers a bad experience you may have had, please just take a breather, walk away, go and get a drink of water. And when you're feeling a little bit more calm, do please come back if you can. And I would like to encourage everyone, if you're experiencing anything like this, to please seek professional help if you are a victim of domestic and family violence. In Australia, we call domestic abuse domestic and family violence. Other countries call it domestic abuse, but I'm talking about one and the same thing. Of course, in Australia, there was a federal legislation where they introduced the extra words family violence, because when children witness domestic violence, it has a very negative impact on them as well. So that was, you know, the name change was instituted. So when I say domestic and family violence, it's meaning the same as domestic abuse. So if we go on to the next slide, I've managed to get some resources from in South Africa. I can't, and you can see those on the slide there. I cannot say from personal experience if they're any good in the South African ones, but they're the ones I could find. And it is very important to reach out if you are experiencing something that's you think is domestic and family violence. Of course, you can reach out to your Vaishnavi minister for help in this respect as well. And then on the right-hand side of that, you'll see some different contacts for Australia, because I'm hoping that some Australian devotees are also watching this. So if you can't get all of those down, you can ask us to send those to you, and we can. So we'll go on to the next slide. Now, recently I've been attending I've attended many different workshops as a student in this arena. And recently out of Melbourne Temple, we had a wonderful lady called Krishna, who works for a company called Faith for Change. And it's a Victorian government initiative. So a couple of these slides are from that workshop, and I will cite them as out of respect for her. It's actually a great project that's being undertaken across Victoria that's the state of Victoria in Australia, to respond to the rising levels of family violence within our society. So they're taking on that, you know, very seriously. And of course, across the world, there's now a stronger focus on not only immediate services for domestic and family violence victims, but also for primary prevention, which is how to nip it right in the very bud. So it's very important that we, feel safe in our surroundings, about our work and our service. And we need to feel safe in our homes, of course. That's very important. And we need to feel safe practicing our faith. So I always consider that it's our birthright to be able to practice devotional service in a safe and encouraging environment. And if that's not being provided, then we need to examine that very, very carefully. And always in domestic and family violence, and you'll see through the other slides, how important is safety first, very important. In one workshop I attended last year, was actually for frontline workers in domestic and family violence. And the first thing they ask anyone who comes to them for help is the question, are you safe? So this is very, very important. And as we go through, you'll see different reasons why we need to always take this into, utmost consideration. So we'll go into slide 7. And I mentioned that statistically, women are predominantly the victims. These statistics came from Krishnan in Faith for Change. In the South African statistics, I based that on a study that was a 1998 study, so it's fairly old. I couldn't get, brand new ones in, they weren't available to me. But just for example, there were 1,394 men interviewed through the South African Medical Council, and 50% said that they had physically abused their female partners at their homes. And that's, it's really still the prevention of domestic and family violence is still a very new movement in some countries. Another study done in 2010, which was by the United Nations, they found that a majority of men and over half of women that were surveyed believed that women should obey their husbands. It is not uncommon for the abuse to begin with the girls who are still teenagers, and it is not uncommon for women to tolerate the abuse they are receiving because it is a very common practice in South Africa. So I personally do not have experience of that, but this is what the statistics point to. And in Australia, for instance, 1 woman a week will be murdered as a result of domestic and family violence. I'm not talking about within ISKCON, of course, but externally to ISKCON. And when people are presented at hospitals as, suffering some injury from domestic and family violence, 6 of men will present that at a hospital, but 85% of women will present at a hospital with injuries from domestic violence. And what I'd be really curious would be if any of that 6% of men who are presenting at a hospital with injuries, is that because their wives were trying to protect themselves? I don't really know, but it's a good point. So statistically, it's pretty horrific everywhere. And I have to say, unfortunately, with our recent pandemic, I'm in Mayapur at the moment, and I've been in lockdown for quite a long time. The temple is just opening now for restricted visits between certain times, maintaining social distancing, of course. And I happened to go for a long extended bath in the Ganges for the first time in many months. And I contracted a cold because a storm came in and we all got very cold. So if I sound a bit sniffly and a bit nasally, that's why I'm struggling with a bit of a cold. So the results with the COVID-19, of course, a lot of people are experiencing more stress, but there's a huge rise in domestic and family violence as well across the globe. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at some of the Sastra. What is it saying? Prabhupada describes in Manjulila that a man in devotional service is automatically non-violent. He is the best of gentlemen. The protection of women maintains the chastity of the society by which we can get a good generation for peace, tranquility, and progress of life. And then how important is the protection of children? So I'd just like to address the second point, where the protection of women maintains the chastity of the society. So I'd like to examine a little bit, what does protection mean? It does not mean the ability to lord it over your dependents or the vulnerable. It doesn't mean that the husband in the house has the right to actually lord it over all of the dependents in his household. As an organisation, we need to be honest and not gloss over any bad behaviour. I hear it many times where a woman will say, oh, he's such a nice devotee at the temple. When he comes home, somehow or other, what I say agitates him. But actually, it doesn't mean that even if you behave nicely in one way, it doesn't mean that you can forget about the bad behaviour in another way. For example, if you're charged with a crime, you can't get off the punishment by saying, oh, but I've been really good in all the other ways. I've given a lot of money in charity, or I did this, or I did that. But it doesn't nullify it. You're actually, you've got to bear the brunt of your punishment. So as an organisation, we need to be honest and not gloss over that bad behaviour. And transparency, combating such anomalies, shows integrity and strength, which is actually the finest preaching tool. So we always want to try and behave in such a way, as I said earlier, that Srila Prabhupada would be pleased. Krishna's witnessing in the heart our behaviour. And this goes for everyone, of course, but particularly, for the vulnerable. It's very important that they are protected. And unfortunately, no large organisation can prevent unwanted elements creeping in. I always give the example in my seminars that there's the microcosm, which is the outside world. And where do ISKCON members come from? They come from that macrocosm, that outside world, and we're that microcosm. But it's very important to remember that even though we're trying very hard to be pure in heart and behave properly, we do still have bad habits. So we need to remember that purity is the force, and this means even behind closed doors, and not just putting on this devotional face when we're at the temple, but always being conscious of being of behaving properly. And sometimes people have misused Chanakya Pandit's quote, "You can beat your mind, your wife, or a dog with a shoe." That is a highly inappropriate quote. I've done a little bit of a survey with some women, and I've said, or not just women, but with devotees. They've said, so have you ever heard of this quote of Chanakya Pandit? Some say yes, many times. Others say, I've never heard of it, which I'm very grateful for. And Chanakya Pandit, he was not a spiritualist, he was not a transcendentalist. Prabhupada did quote him a lot, but he was a social commentator and an advisor actually to a king, I think it was Chandragupta. So, if that quote is ever cited to you, it is totally, totally inappropriate and totally not in our mood. And in the 12th canto, chapter 342, it describes the degradation of Kali Yuga. Men will no longer protect their elderly parents, their children, or their respectable wives. Thoroughly degraded, they will care only to satisfy their own bellies and genitals. And, it's Kali Yuga is advancing and it is getting worse. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So this is a beautiful quote from Bhagavatam. In religion, economic development, the wife is the cause of all kinds of success in religion, economic development, sense gratification, and ultimately salvation. And when one accepts a wife, it is to be understood that he is being helped in his progressive march towards liberation. So this partnership, this marriage, it's a sacred relationship. And it can be executed properly, for example, with right brahmacharya training, if, you know, that's been the case. Prabhupada says that when you're trained as brahmachari, that's, you know, gives very good training later in married life. And how important it is for the husband and the wife to treat each other with respect and love. It's so critical for the happiness of the family and the home. Next slide. And Prabhupada says, however low a person may be, he is never unkind to his children, his wife, and nearest kin. Even a tiger is kind to its cubs, for within the animal kingdom, cubs are treated very nicely. So Prabhupada's, you know, the Sastra's being pretty strong here, that no matter how degraded a person may be or how much of a Kali Yugaite someone will be, is never unkind to children, wife, and nearest kin. And of course, domestic and family violence extends not just to your wife, your immediate partner, but also abuse of the elderly, for example. And I read recently that one of my god sisters, Chintamani, and Chintamani used to be married to Sudama Maharaj, who's now left his body. And they were in Japan, and Prabhupada was there in Japan. And I just read this recently, actually. And a couple had come through, you know, because Prabhupada was there, so a couple had come through to, you know, spend a bit of time with Srila Prabhupada. And a report came back to Srila Prabhupada that actually the husband was beating the wife. And Prabhupada was very displeased, and he said, a man who beats his wife is a dog. So Srila Prabhupada was very, very damning on this. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And I don't know if any of you have heard my seminar on the importance of women in ISKCON, but in that seminar I give many, many quotes about how Prabhupada felt about the women in the movement. And one of this is on a morning walk in Bombay. He said that these women are not ordinary women, they are preachers. They are Vaishnavas, and by their association one becomes a Vaishnava. So how is it possible then for one of the partners in a relationship to abuse their devotee partner? It's really untenable. It's asastric, it's asastralayam. And of course it is Vaishnava Parad. And one time Srila Prabhupada stated that women, devotee women, are angels. And if you offer obeisances to them, you will be liberated. So Srila Prabhupada was very strong on that point. And offending any Vaishnava, of course, male or female, is a great offence. So it's important to acknowledge that violence, this family and domestic violence, is aberrant behaviour. Beating one's wife or one's husband, if that's the case, or using any form of domestic violence, it's not normal. It's not a healthy response to life's challenges. And it can also harm the children, who become anxious and distressed when they're witnessing such violence. Or who knows, they may even be at the receiving end if they try and protect their mother, for example. It's also been proven that children who witness domestic violence are more prone to mental illness, drug abuse, and more likely to be violent with their families as adults. It becomes learned behaviour. And of course, marital violence can also undermine a family's faith in Krishna. If children see that their father is mistreating their mother and he's a devotee of Krishna, then what are they going to do? Are they going to be feeling, oh, yes, Krishna consciousness is something I want to engage in? No, I do not think so. And sometimes, you know, unfortunately, domestic and family violence can be lethal. I cited those statistics to you before. It can be very, very dangerous, and we shouldn't encourage women who are being victims of domestic and family violence to stay with their husbands. Can be a very volatile and very dangerous situation. And of course, it's, you know, unacceptable if someone uses the scriptures to encourage them to stay. Oh, it's just your bad karma, you should just tolerate. Krishna's giving you so many tests. And if we go into the next slide, we can see that in, actually, the first resolution came about in North America in about January of 2019. And then being on the National Council in Australia, I was able to have this proposal also passed in Australia, that domestic and family violence is illegal, indefensible, and never acceptable within the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Any interpretation of Vaishnava religious or social teachings that condones, endorses, or justifies such abuse is rejected by the National Council of Australia. And then I was very, very happy to see that the International GBC has actually passed the resolution in March 2020 that, I just got a message, start my video, that domestic abuse, if you don't know about this resolution, it's a very important resolution. Domestic abuse is indefensible, illegal in many countries, and never acceptable within the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON. Any interpretation of Vaishnava religious or social teachings that condones, endorses, or justifies domestic abuse is rejected by the governing body commission. So that's very, very important. And, you know, I'm sorry to say, but if your spiritual authority, whether it's your spiritual master, your temple president, if they say to you that you should just tolerate the domestic violence, you know, go and stay with someone else. If it's really bad, then come back to the home when your husband calms down. I'm sorry, they are not following GBC law. So it's very, very important that we understand that. And later on in the seminar, I'll talk about the cycle of abuse and also a very interesting thing called Duluth's wheel. So let's go on to the next slide now. So how do we identify the nuances of domestic and family violence? When we do, then what can we do about it? So the main thing, and I've been gleaning a lot of this from different seminars I've been attending as a student, is that domestic and family violence, it's very different from conflict in a marriage. And sometimes this gets confusing. A husband and wife might be having some rows, they might be squabbling. That is not necessarily domestic and family violence. Domestic and family violence is a systematic methodology of exerting power and control. And conflict in the marriage is something that does happen. You know, it's always hard enough to live with yourself, let alone live with someone else. So these conflicts, it's important to distinguish between the two. You know, there's no violence, but there might be, you know, a bit of shouting and, you know, banging of pots or something. Not banging the pots on your husband's head or your wife's head. So one of the important things that we need to remember is that you need to nip it in the bud, because what happens with domestic and family violence, it often escalates. So, for example, when someone first gets married, and this is for someone who is desiring to have power and control over, in this instance, let's say the wife. It can be a husband also, but it'll start small. It'll be, you know, oh, I don't like you wearing that. Why are you wearing that? Or, no, I don't want you to go and see that friend. I don't like them. I'll let you see this person, or I'll let you see that person, but not those other friends. They're not, I don't think they're good for you. Or, you have to come to Mongolati with me every day. I don't care if you're awake all night with our little baby. You have to come to Mongolati. All of these things, they just start small. But once the abuser understands that they can get away with this power and control, then it exacerbates. It's not often that immediately there'll be violence. It's slowly testing the waters. So if you can stop it escalating newly in your relationship, then it's very good. It's very good. You can put a stop to it and say, no, this is not working. You cannot speak to me like this. You cannot behave like this. We really need to go and see marriage counselling. We need to get some advice on, how to deal with each other properly. Then that's very good. When the domestic and family violence is escalated, then marriage counselling, unfortunately, does not work as both partners going to a marriage guidance counsellor. They need to go separately. And one can ask, well, why? Well, the reason why is because if a couple in a domestic and family violent situation, if both members go to see a marriage counsellor, then if the wife, for example, let's say the wife, she's the victim, she may say something that will really aggravate the situation. And when she goes home, she might be in big trouble. So it's very important to, once again, be aware of safety. So very important to make sure you seek that professional help. And if you're someone who you think, that you may be using domestic and family violence, that you have got this power and control issue, then, do reach out. There's many professional bodies that can help men or women deal with this situation. So let's have we'll talk about the signs of domestic and family violence later on in the presentation. So going on to the next slide. And this is also, and the reason why I've started a lot with Sastra, because I think it's important for us to be able to place it in our context, in our devotional context. And Prabhupada says that, in Bhagavatam it says, the wife is dependent on the husband, and if the husband is a Vaishnava, then naturally she shares the devotional service of the husband because she renders him service. And this reciprocation of service and love between husband and wife is the ideal of a householder's life. So, that's very, I particularly like this quote, because what does it actually mean? It means reciprocation of service and love. It's not imbalanced power and control where, your place is in the kitchen. I don't want to hear any opinions you might want to express to me. I'm making all the decisions in the family. You're a fool, you're foolish, you don't, have anything valuable to say, so just keep your mouth quiet. This is not what it means. This is not reciprocation of service and love. And in the next, that's text 1, in the next text in chapter 23, canto 3, Prabhupada says that the husband is a very intimate friend, very intimate friend. And he continues in that purport, and please take a note of these and read them later, that if the husband does something wrong, the wife must tolerate it. But I would swear on my life that Prabhupada did not mean that the wife must tolerate violence in the home, because that is not Vaishnava behavior. He is referring perhaps to a cranky husband, but not a violent one. So if we look at the next slide, this is a very interesting slide. We can see the difference between equality versus equity. So on the top slide, you see, okay, everyone's got a box to stand on. One just happens to be a bit short. You can't see over it. So they've all got a box, but it's not equitable. So you see in the second part of that slide, there's 2 boxes there. So the little child can be an adult, can actually see over the fence. So the equity is very important. So the The dictionary definition of equality is the state or quality of being equal, correspondence in quantity, degree, value, rank, or ability. And equity is the quality of being fair or impartial. For example, the equity of Solomon, something that is fair and just. And then looking at the bottom picture, you can see, okay, everyone's got wheels, the child, the woman, the man, but not the person in the wheelchair. I mean, he has wheels, but he's not part of the race. So equity is where you can see he's actually got abilities as well, that he can engage in the same activity. And this slide is something that I got from Faith for Change, which showing the difference between equity and equality. So having a look at this slide here, which is what does respect and equity look like? So respect is, and we'll just examine both sides of these. In respect column, you're respected for who you are. Okay, you might be, you know, a wife of someone important, or you might be, you know, have some seniority somehow or other. But equity is when you're treated the same as anyone else. So it's not that, you know, the Vaishnavis have a certain little box and that's their little box and they have to stay in that little box. And I would like to add, I'm not a feminist by any means, but I'm very much for women being able to serve in whatever capacity they can serve and not be restricted by the fact that they are in a woman's body. So you're respected for expressing your opinion. And then the equity side is you're having the same chance to express your opinion. I think that's pretty clear. There's a very big difference between the two. And then we're looking a bit further down, respected for your ability. And then in the equity column, you're having the same access to gain experience. So for a lot of circumstances, women aren't encouraged to take leadership roles, for instance. So that's not really, you know, you might be respected for having ability in a certain area, but when you don't have the same access to gain experience, then that's not equity. And respected for your contribution. And then equity is having your contribution count as much as anyone else's. So it's very, very interesting. And recently, the Victorian government in Australia, the state of Victoria, they actually included in their legislation of what constitutes domestic and family violence as not being able to be a part of the decision-making in the family. It's very interesting, and I thought that was very important. So we'll look on to the next slide. So once again, I'm touching on the conflict versus the violence. And we need to think about that carefully because it's not the same. Conflict is not always violence. It's often just a difference of opinion or thought. You know, the husband might want things done a certain way. The wife might want something done a different way. So you resolve those conflicts by how do you do that? You do it by debate, calm, peaceful debate. May I like to give you my opinion about this? And the other person, okay, well, that's good, but how about looking at it from this side? You collaborate together, you work it out together, and the understanding, it's very important. And this debate, how to resolve conflicts, the debate, the collaboration, understanding each other, they're actually the hallmarks of a healthy and safe relationship, and of course in our communities as well. So it may be a little hard to distinguish the difference, but if there's any violence involved, of course, then you know that it is not just a conflict, but it is bordering on that domestic and family violence. So domestic and family violence, in the next slide, you can see it happens when one person in a relationship uses violence or abuse to control the other person. And it can cover many things: harassment, intimidation, belittling. But the main thing to remember is it takes a form of pattern of intentional, coercive behaviours used over the other partner by using repeated abuse. It's not a one-off thing. It's a pattern and it's repeated. And sometimes people say to me, oh, and I've heard in different workshops, oh, no, it's my fault. My husband just has an anger management problem. But the experts all say, actually, that is no excuse for abuse. The anger management may be some kind of exacerbator, but it's not causative. It's not the cause of the domestic violence. And the reason, logically, we can look at that is because, okay, at work, does the, let's use the husband once again, sorry husbands, of course scapegoats here, but does he use violence at work? Does he, hit his boss or yell at his boss or belittle his boss, or does he do that to his work colleagues? No, he does it to the vulnerable person, and that often is the case of the wife in the home. And so whether you're a young person or you're an older person, you may be experiencing some kind of elder abuse in the home, whether you're male or female, whether you've been in a relationship for many years or you're just starting out in your marriage or relationship, it's important that you evaluate whether your relationship continues to be safe and respectful. I'm not advocating divorce by any means, but I am advocating human rights. So please note the words, the pattern of intentional coercive behaviours by using repeated abuse. And that's, these are helpful keywords to help us understand what situations we're in or perhaps our friends are in. And we'll go on to the next slide. So Faith for Change, which was the workshops I attended recently, they state that domestic violence refers to violence, abuse, and intimidation between people who are currently or have previously been in an intimate relationship. Sometimes the abuse will continue even when you're separated. Unfortunately, there may be, situations where the perpetrator continues to respond a bit violently. And they use they use violence to control and dominate the other person. And that, of course, causes fear. It causes, physical harm and or psychological harm. And it's a violation of human rights. And even in some cases, some carers, may be victims as well. And we'll go on, please, the next one. So in Australia, I don't know what the law is in South Africa, but in Australia, any use of domestic and family violence is referred to in each state's legislation, specifically the act that covers the prevention of domestic and family violence. And in some cases, it can be determined criminal, in addition to being dealt with in the civil court. Once again, I'm not sure about the South African side of things. In Australia, there's huge focus on prevention of domestic and family violence because it is very, very prominent. And unfortunately, as I said before, all over the world. So, and that means, of course, that there is domestic and family violence in ISKCON as well. So when we look at the next slide, we can see attitudes that drive particular types of behaviour. And this was a slide that Anu Krishnan used in her presentation to us, Faith for Change presentation. So there's the stereotyping. So what constitutes, for example, the Vedic wife? The silent, submissive, and victim of the whims of the husband. No, that shouldn't be it. And as I mentioned before, excluding someone from the decision-making is now a new type of abuse that the state of Victoria has incorporated. And, you know, keep in mind that research shows that domestic abuse has occurred throughout history and cuts across socioeconomic status. It's not just for poor people, it's for rich people. Cuts across education, whether you're poorly educated, highly educated, whether you're male or female, no matter what your sexual orientation is. Of course, in ISKCON, we don't have same-sex marriages, but this is more of an external application. And of course, any other category. As I said, it's not perpetrated just by men on women or other vulnerable parties, but it is mostly men who use this form of behaviour, unfortunately. And just some statistics there. And I think that slide has been repeated. And we'll go on to the next one. So in Australia, almost 40% of women continue to experience violence from their partner while temporarily separated, which is quite, you know, worrying. And 1 in 4 women have experienced emotional abuse by a current or former partner since the age of 15. So it's, you know, really quite horrific signs there. And, you know, there's lots of Australian statistics, but we won't go into those too much. Relating to South Africa now, that the World Health Organization, they found that 60,000 women and children are victims of domestic violence in South Africa. But it also stated when I was doing this research that it's very hard to gather the statistics, the statistical data in South Africa, because domestic violence is rarely reported, according to this survey. In the South African Medical Research Council, they found in household surveys, they found that 40% of men have hit their partners, and also that South Africa has one of the highest murder rates for women in the world, with 56% of the female victims killed by their own partners. So they're, you know, as I said, I'm not targeting South Africa, especially with this, just to give the our South African attendees a bit of an eye-opener here, but just throughout the world, it's like that. So if we go on to the next chart, and it's, you know, it's very important that ISKCON really has a good focus, and the GBC resolution was a fantastic step in this direction. So on this chart, we can see how easily domestic and family violence can infiltrate our society, can infiltrate ISKCON, and it's about breaking the cycle. Remembering once again that ISKCON's the microcosm, that we came from that macrocosm of the materially influenced world, and we still, you know, have some conditioning. And unfortunately, we can see how domestic and family violence has become part of the fabric of society in general, not speaking about ISKCON here specifically. And it costs governments more than any other crime, at least in Australia. And therefore, at least the Australian government is investing very generously into educating and supporting victims. We'll go on to the next slide. So in most countries, it's considered illegal, and we know that it can be physical, emotional, psychological, with threats, name calling, property damage, and we'll examine these in more detail a little bit later on. And it spreads through all communities, cultures, and sexes of all ages. But please be aware, if you are experiencing abuse or violence, it is not your fault. It is the abuser who is responsible. And in most countries, the abuser is breaking the law, and some types of domestic and family violence are criminal. We'll go into the next slide. And we'll go on to the next slide after that. So why don't women or the victims of domestic and family violence, why don't they actually report? Why don't they seek advice or support? Well, often they feel that they can deal with the issues themselves. Many of them feel that there's a stigma surrounding domestic and family violence, and they really, just don't want to shame the family. They think it's shameful. Sometimes they might think that the incident wasn't serious enough. So these are all different percentages where these Australian statistics. Feeling that shame or embarrassment, it can be very, excuse my cold, it's getting a little bit wild here. It's very hot here in Mayapur, so it's hard having a cold, you need the fan on. And common reasons that men gave for not seeking advice or support was, they felt that it wasn't serious enough to seek help. They felt they could deal with it themselves, and they did not want or need help. Sometimes the increased tolerance is due to cultural differences. In some cultures or in certain ethnicities, the domestic and family violence is woven more seamlessly into the fabric of the society. I know in India it's a lot more acceptable for a man to, slap his wife than, say, it would be in some other countries. And unfortunately, it's statistically proven that domestic and family violence does damage the social, health, and an economic fabric of our communities, and it threatens our faith, and it creates dysfunctional patterns for future generations. So it's not just it stops in the immediate family, but it can exacerbate, continue in subsequent generations. And as I said before, what message is that giving? And, as I said before, the vulnerable are at the greater risk. For example, in Australia, our Indigenous women, our Aboriginal women are at greater risk. Young women, pregnant women, women separating from their partners, women with disability or experiencing financial hardship. It's something that I'm financially dependent on my husband. How do I get help? Of course, there are a lot of fantastic services out there that do help. And of course, for a man or a woman who experienced abuse or witnessed domestic violence as children before the age of 15 are also at increased risk. So if we'll go on to the next slide now, this lists all the different kinds of abuse. So it doesn't mean that it's only, young people being abused or older people. It's across the board. So it's important to evaluate the situation that you're in. And domestic violence does have many ugly faces, unfortunately. So, for example, with physical violence, there's threat of being killed. There's the hitting, the slapping. Statistics, or rather experts list strangling, choking, suffocating, punching, hitting, slapping, hair pulling, spitting, throwing objects, reckless driving. You might be in a car with your partner and he's driving recklessly, trying to frighten you. Use of weapons, throwing objects, being locked inside or outside the home, not letting you inside the home. Damage to your possessions or your family's possessions. Cruelty to your pets. That's also a form of physical violence. It can be, you know, hurting your pets or forcing, threatening cruelty to your pets, making you, you know, a forced diet, withholding access to medical help, or trivializing medical problems, taunting someone in a vulnerable state. These are all different types of violence. Then we go on to, of course, the sexual abuse is when marital rape, when the partner forces himself on his wife who's unwilling. That's also a sign of domestic and family violence. And emotional abuse. So psychological abuse and emotional abuse, they're kind of similar, but there is a distinction. It can be difficult to identify, especially because emotional abuse and psychological abuse is non-physical. But emotional abuse includes things like blaming a partner for all the problems in a relationship, constantly comparing them with others to undermine their self-esteem and self-worth. You know, the husband's always in a bad mood, intentionally embarrasses them in public. And emotional abuse is very much your emotional overload is very much understood by the abuser. So say, for example, if you're you're very conscious, perhaps you're worried that you're maybe not the best mother you could be, something like that. You might be worried, oh, I'm not a good mother. And then if your abuser in using emotional abuse, he will say, oh, you're such a terrible mother. I don't know what kind of a mother you are. That's emotional abuse. Psychological abuse is more things like making you doubt yourself, gaslighting, which is a term psychologists use, undermining you. There was an example that I was given recently where a husband, he didn't generate any kind of, this is not within ISKCON, this is external to ISKCON, he didn't generate any kind of emotional abuse, but he would do this one thing. His wife would fill the car up with petrol and, you know, a couple of times a week or 3 times a week after work, she'd drive home, put the car where it was meant to go, and then in the morning she would actually go to drive the car off to work and realise that there was no petrol in the car. And she actually became so convinced that she was having mental blackouts that she went to see a psychiatrist about it. And of course the psychiatrist was, you know, very aware of all different kinds of, you know, abuse. And her alarm bells went off. So with the help of police, she was able to have a look at some CCTV footage, and it caught the husband actually, you know, emptying the petrol out at night. You know, he didn't do anything else, but he did this thing, this psychological abuse that really made her doubt herself in a serious way. Or it could be, there was another example that I was given where the wife would be running around the house just before work in the morning, desperately trying to find where she put the car keys. You know, she thought she put them in a particular place, but she couldn't find them anywhere. And she'd be running around the house like a mad thing, trying to find the keys, get the kids to school, go to work, etc., etc. And what had been happening is the husband had actually been taking them off the key rack, you know, the little rack where all the keys would go, and hiding them. And then after, you know, 15 minutes of her running around, getting late for work, he'd secretly just deposit them back on the key rack, and then say to her, oh, look, you crazy woman, you're so stupid, they're sitting there, right there all the time. So these are the psychological, emotional abuse, you know, and they can be just as devastating as physical abuse, because the psychological abuse can affect your inner thoughts and feelings, as well as exert control over your life. You may feel uncertain about the world around you, about your, you know, your own your own self. It can feel unsafe in the home. And it destroys the intimate relationships and friendships and even your own relationship with yourself. And cultural abuse, it's very similar to spiritual or religious abuse. Spiritual and cultural abuse are means by which a perpetrator can exercise dominance and control over you, over a victim who's especially vulnerable due to their spirituality or their cultural identity. For example, say an Indian lady comes to the West to, get married, and her Indian husband is being very absorbed now in Western culture, for example, and he starts, paying her out for, wearing Indian clothes, or, why are you dressing like that? You look like a fool, you look like an idiot, or it can be the other way around. So these behaviours belittle the person. They may belittle your beliefs or your practices. They may prevent you from practicing your spiritual or cultural activities, and, manipulating in that way, misusing perhaps of traditions and practices. And then financial abuse, of course, is, or cyber abuse is, examining all your Facebook posts, threatening to send personal videos out that, the husband may have taken of you, Facebook reprisals, examining all your phone, who you called, why you called them, emails, that's kind of cyber abuse. And financial abuse is, of course, not allowing you to have control over your money, keeping very tight reins on that. Perhaps your salary has to go into an account that he controls. And then you have restricting social access. You can't go and see the friends you want to see. You're limited. He's limiting you in the kind of friendships that you're having. Your social access, no, you can't go see your family. You have to stay at home. All these different types of things. And as I said before, now in Australia, in Victoria, at least in Australia, being excluded from decision making is considered an abuse, and of course elder abuse. So these are all different nuances of domestic and family violence, and it's very important to understand, is this repeated abuse? We're not talking about one-off things. And if we can go on to the next slide. We spoke about the sexual abuse. It's that marital rape. In Australia, it is a crime. And we discussed the different kinds of emotional and psychological abuse. Sometimes they might even threaten violence. I'll kill myself if you leave me. If you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. They can use emotional blackmail like that, undermine your self-esteem. They can imply or spread rumours of mental illness. Who's ever heard the saying, oh, you're just crazy, husband to the wife? That happens quite a lot. They can turn the children against you. So, for example, they will make you be the one who's always punishing the children, whereas he'll be the gift giver. So that's a form of subtle abuse there. Invasion of your privacy, denying education, and these kind of Jekyll and Hyde personality mind games. The verbal abuse, once again, it's name-calling, sarcasm, fault-finding, particularly in public humiliation, dominating conversation, yelling, shouting at you, always correcting. And the gaslighting is, it's a very interesting, it's a form of psychological manipulation, and it seeks to sow seeds of doubt in an individual. And if you have any questions about these, please, you can write them into our host. And we'll go on to the next slide now. And it goes on to a bit more details there about the social abuse, the spiritual and cultural abuse. Of course, there can be, for example, with social abuse, they may also disallow you from getting your driver's license. Of course, controlling who you speak to, sabotaging social outings, something that you're really looking forward to going, and last minute the sabotage. He needs total attention all the times, monitors your phone calls, etc. Can get to a point of stalking. That's, usually when the relationship is really breaking down. And with spiritual and cultural abuse also, it can be, not allowing any negotiation in how your children is being educated. For example, they might say, no, we're sending our son to Gurukul. That's it. Don't want to hear what you say. I'm the decision maker in the family, and that's what we're doing. That is not, that's really bordering on abuse, not giving you an opportunity to negotiate in how your child's being educated. I'm not saying, of course, Gurukul's not good. All my 3 sons went to Gurukul, but I'm just using that as an example. So we'll go on to the next slide. And gaslighting, as I said, seeks to manipulate you, hurt children, pets, relatives. I've covered that already. Taking away your freedom of movement or locking you in the house. There's so many nuances here in domestic and family violence. It's really quite incredible. But please keep in mind difference between conflict in a marriage and domestic and family violence. So we look at the next slide, which is some of the results of domestic and family violence. It can happen to anyone. As I said before, poor, rich, educated, not educated, male, female, but it does cause untold suffering in the form of behavioural issues and mental illness, as well as increased risk of physical illness, because even though you may not be physically abused, being in constant fear actually really affects your physical health and mental well-being. I'm not just talking about, a physical thing like a black eye or bruises, but it causes increased conditions or risk of conditions such as obesity. You can develop eating disorders, diabetes, and also cardiovascular disease. And sometimes it's, the common hidden problems in general practice for GPs that patients don't often really reveal what's going on. And it has a major effect on the physical and mental health of the kids, of course, of young people and other family members. And witnessing domestic violence is considered hazardous to the health and well-being of children. And we'll learn more about that in the second session. So we'll go on to the next slide. And, domestic violence is the leading cause of illness and mortality for women under 45. So it's not to be, in Australia at least, not to be underestimated. We're not going to watch this video at the moment because it's a video that's very confrontational, and it was taken from a very well-known Australian news commentary channel show called 60 Minutes. And it was actually focusing on a man who was jailed for domestic violence against his wife, or two separate men. And it's very, very shocking, but it does go on for 15 minutes, so we won't watch that. But you can probably see similar things on TED Talks as well, just to show how varied domestic and family violence is. So now we're going to talk about the cycle of violence. And I alluded to this before when I said if your spiritual mentor, even, I have to say, even your spiritual master, if he says, look, just tolerate the abuse, it's your karma, this is Krishna testing you, this is your opportunity to, you know, make spiritual advancement, and then when it gets particularly violent, go away for a while, and then come back, and then if it escalates again, go away again. No, this is really not acceptable, and it will not stop. It will continue and actually get worse. So there was a well-known doctor, Lenore Walker, in 1979. She developed this cycle of violence model, and it describes a common pattern in which the violence builds. So you'll see at the top there, for example, you've got the explosive peak of violence stage, and then it's like a catch-22 situation. Then there'll be remorse by the perpetrator. Oh, I promise I'll never do this again. I'm so sorry. I promise I'll change. Please come back to me. It'll never happen again. And then there's a bit of a honeymoon period. The perpetrator is really trying to, make you feel confident in the relationship again. They promise to change, a steep recommitment to the relationship. And this honeymoon phase, even both parties may be in denial about the abuse. And then gradually, she's a Grievious, I'll come back, we'll start again, it'll never happen again. And then slowly, the tensions build again. And then as the tensions build, kapow, you have the explosive peak of violence. And then it self-perpetuates. You get the remorse, then you get the pursuit, then you get the honeymoon phase, the tensions build again, and then you have this peak of violence exploding once more. So the only way that cycle can be broken is when the perpetrator, of course, either is, jailed for it or imprisoned, or they actually go and get professional counselling by a counsellor who is particularly expert in men who use violence in a relationship. As I said before, trying to get marriage counselling together will not work. So we'll go on to another slide, and this is called the Power and Control Wheel. And that was developed by the Duluth, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it actually, Duluth Institute in Minnesota. And this provides a complete range of psychological and mental health services through a model of treatment that focuses on rehabilitation. That's what this institute does. And they developed this Power and Control Wheel, where the goal of the person using abusive tactics such as physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, financial abuse, and we discuss some of these, and it outlines some examples of the abusive tactics. So, for example, the coercion and threats, you can see that there in the slide. So they make or even carry out threats to do something to hurt the victim, in this case, say for example, the wife. They may even threaten to leave her themselves, commit suicide, or report her to welfare, may make her drop the charges, even make her do illegal things. And then you have the intimidation, particularly in ethnic communities, threaten to send the wife back to her family. So, for example, in India, I'm sending you back to your family. You're a terrible wife. I'm sending you back. If you don't, if you have any arguments against how I'm, behaving, I'll just send you back. Might destroy her things. Might threaten her and say, look, I've got connections in your family's home country, in your home country. I can threaten your family there. Make her feel afraid by using looks, actions and gestures, smashing things, destroying property, displaying weapons. And we talked about the difference between emotional and psychological abuse. the use of isolation. For example, making her stay in the kitchen when friends visit, controlling everything that she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement. And then the partner may say, oh, it's just because I love you so much. It's just because I love you so much. And he'll say, I'm just jealous because I love you so much. That's why I'm, minimizing your activities. Another ploy is often, oh, you just make me do this. You make me lose my temper. They want to shift blame to others, might make light of the abuse and not take the victim's concerns about it seriously. They'll try and shift responsibility for the abusive behavior, saying it's all your fault. If you just didn't make me lose my temper, then none of this would happen. And with using the children, he may say to her, well, you're spoiling the kids. Or he'll discipline them and he'll make her discipline them. And as I said before, he'll buy the gifts. He might threaten to send the children back to his parents in the home country, to his family, and make her feel guilty about the children. If there's a separation occurring, he may use the children to relay messages and using visitation to harass her, threatening to take the children away. And I know one case like this where the devotee, she didn't tell anyone about the abuse that she was suffering. And even now when her husband has separated from her, he comes to see the child, she has to make sure that she doesn't do anything to upset him, because he will once again come into the house and use violence, break things and threaten her. So with the male privilege, he may constantly remind her he's the head of the family and the decision maker. Everything has to be just as how he wants it. Treating her like a servant and making all the big decisions. Of course, we all like to serve. It's our role. We serve each other. The husband protects and wife serves. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's wrong, but when the woman is being demeaned and just, shoved away, and you're only good for washing clothes and cooking, that kind of thing is very poor. So we'll go on to the next slide. And I said earlier in the program in the seminar, that, it's a progressive tactic. We need to be alert to those early signs. So if you're early on, if your partner is trying to control, for example, what friends you see, trying to control how you dress, not just saying, oh, that's a nice colour, but I like you better in that colour, or that's a pretty sari, but I thought you looked really lovely in the green sari. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about controlling everything about how you look. Once again, not engaging you in family decisions. And for example, they might use sastra. Oh, Bhagavatam says that women are less intelligent. Of course, they only cherry pick exactly, those kind of quotes. They don't cherry pick the other kinds of quotes where totally supporting women. And for example, Krishna himself says in Bhagavad Gita how women are the, fine intelligence, memory, all of these things. They only cite the one or two other references. So they might use sastra to say, well, sastra's not wrong. You're meant to just do what I tell you. You're meant to be a Vedic submissive wife. Can't you even do that? It's subtle nuances, but you would get the picture. And I was told recently about a lecture that Radhanath Swami said one of his disciples, or two of his disciples, were marrying each other. And in the lecture he gave, he said that every man wants a Sita for a wife, but the problem is they are not Ramachandras themselves, which I thought was very very interesting. So how are we going for time here? Should we stop for questions now?
We can stop for questions. Are we stopping here for the session and we'll continue with the rest of the slides for the second session?
Yes, well, we have till 2:30, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me just do 2 more slides. So we go on to the next slide. So with the warning signs, so whether it's a friend, family member, or neighbour, we can also be active bystanders. We can be proactive with potential victims. And there's a good chance that some of us know someone who's experienced it, even if, you know, the victim may not be sure themselves. So we need to, you know, learn how to understand the signs of domestic and family violence. So it's very important that you do not go up to someone in public. This is a very private, very important thing to understand the safety of the person. But if you might see someone that, you know, their behaviour may have changed quite a lot, perhaps they were a very outgoing person and they've become very withdrawn, you can see that, you know, the wife. So as an active bystander, if you're a friend of that person, you can just, you know, go to them in a private way and just say, look, I've just noticed that you may, you know, you appear to be a little bit different these days. Is there something that, is everything okay with you at home? You know, I offer you complete confidentiality. Is everything okay? You know, that's also something that's very important. And in our next session, we'll talk about how to be an active bystander in a safe way. And we'll also talk about the effect of domestic violence on children. So I hope that you've gleaned something from this. I have been a little bit repetitive about some of the things, but I think it's very important that we, you know, as it happens in the scriptures, things are repeated when they need to be remembered. So we need to try and grasp all of these different nuances in domestic and family violence. And hopefully, with the awareness that's going on, every devotee will be able to practice their devotional life in a safe and happy environment. So Hare Krishna, I'm really grateful to be given this opportunity. And if there are any questions, I can try and answer them for you.
I'll just go onto Facebook and see if there are any questions there. I would like to, okay, so the question comes from someone who says, with COVID-19 and lockdown, there seems to be an increase in domestic violence. Do you think devotees can escape the pressure of this, and how?
What was the last part of the question?
She's saying with COVID-19 and lockdown, it seems to be an increase in domestic violence, and she would like to know how devotees can escape this pressure and how. Like, can we and how? Are we somehow above the normal?
Yeah, really, really good question, actually. And it is true that COVID-19 lockdown has really caused a huge increase in domestic and family violence. I was speaking to a devotee friend of mine in Sydney a few weeks ago, and she's a doctor, a practicing doctor, GP, and she was telling me that she's seeing a lot of victims of domestic and family violence presenting at her surgery. And also just throughout the globe, you can see on any news outlet, they will talk about that rise. So it's very, very difficult because you can't go anywhere. Well, at least in India, you can't. In Australia, I know it's lifting quite a bit, and I'm not sure about South Africa with the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions if they're lifting, but I would recommend that if it's possible to try, if you're in the middle of something that's, you know, very serious and you're not safe, is that you try and reach out to some of the services that might be available to get their professional advice. There was an incident recently where I recommended to the person, or they suggested it actually, and I thought it was a good idea, that they actually just go and stay at a friend's house. Because, you know, she couldn't get back to her own country. She actually wanted to leave her husband, but she couldn't because there's no flights. Just like I can't get a flight back to Australia, although Lord Chaitanya is very kindly sheltering me here in Mayapur. So you have to ascertain if your situation is very dangerous, not safe for you or your children. Find a time, or for your friend, find a time where you can contact some professional service. Don't do it when your husband's in the house or the perpetrator's in the house. Maybe wait, depending on the severity of the lockdown, but maybe wait till he's gone out for a walk or some exercise. But just always remember, safety is a very important aspect of this. And, you know, once the lockdown is, you know, lifted, then you have to make a decision what you can do. In very serious cases when there's, you know, actual physical violence, then, you know, you should contact the police. I hope that gives you some idea.
Thank you very much, Prabhu. That's really helpful. At this time, we don't have any more questions that I can see.
Yeah, that's fine. So if you do have any questions as you, you know, think of them later on, please save them up, and you can send them to the Sadhu Sangha Facebook page, and we can answer them when the next session starts. And hopefully by this second session on Thursday, my cold will have gone away.
So
I don't have a fever, I've just got a little bit of cold.
So we will be joining again. We will be starting the session again at 9:30 on Tuesday morning, same time, same place. And yeah, we can't wait, because I think it's such an important part, especially because domestic violence is such an insidious thing that it does not just affect the person that's being abused, but also the people in the vicinity, and that's something that you will be discussing.
Yes, very good point. And just as a point of information, I'm arranging a Zoom conference with all the Vaishnavi ministers around the world, including Radha Dasi, who's our international minister, and we're going to talk about what are the next steps that we can do now that we have the GBC resolution stating that domestic and family violence is not acceptable within ISKCON. What are our next steps? What can we do to try and make sure that women are provided a safe environment? And, you know, I'll keep everyone posted. If there's any feedback for this, please let me know, because I can't see you face to face. I don't know how you're reacting to this presentation. So if you want to give me any constructive criticism, I very much welcome that as well. Okay, thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Okay, so everybody's... Okay, thank you. Hari Bol Maharaji.
Okay, so is everyone off now?
Not... Yeah, I just have to stop the... Okay, I just stopped the live stream and I stopped the recording.